Saudi Arabia sits on roughly 267 billion barrels of proven oil reserves. At current production rates, that supply lasts approximately 200 years. Yet the Saudi government has spent the past decade building the most expensive economic transformation program in history. Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman calls it Vision 2030. Vision 2030 is a $1 trillion plan to make oil irrelevant to Saudi Arabia's future. That is not just ambitious. That is a structural paradox. Saudi Arabia is funding the escape from oil by selling more oil. Understanding why this creates a trap tells you something fundamental about how resource-dependent economies work. To understand Saudi Arabia's problem today, start with a deal made in 1974. After the oil shock of 1973, U.S. Secretary of State Henry Kissinger flew to Riyadh with an unusual offer. America would provide military protection to the Saudi royal family. America would also guarantee the kingdom's security. In exchange, Saudi Arabia would price all oil exports in US dollars. Saudi Arabia would also recycle those dollars into American treasury bonds. That agreement created what economists call the petrodollar system. Global oil became priced in dollars. Every country on earth now needed dollars to buy energy. Saudi Arabia became the anchor of that system. The US became its guarantor. For 50 years, that deal shaped every major decision Saudi Arabia made. By the time MBS took power in 2016, the numbers were already alarming. Oil accounted for roughly 73% of Saudi government revenue. Oil represented approximately 80% of Saudi export earnings. The non-oil private sector barely existed at any meaningful scale. Roughly two-thirds of employed Saudi nationals worked in the public sector, paid from oil revenues. Saudi Arabia had not built a diversified economy. Saudi Arabia had built an oil revenue distribution system with national infrastructure around it. When oil prices collapsed in 2014 and 2015, the government ran its first major deficits in years. MBS looked at those numbers and concluded the kingdom had perhaps 15 years before the model began to break. The response was Vision 2030, announced in April 2016 with extraordinary confidence. The plan targeted tourism, entertainment, technology, mining, and manufacturing as the pillars of a post-oil economy. Saudi Arabia would host Formula One races, build the world's largest entertainment city, and attract foreign investment. The plan also aimed to bring millions of Saudi women into the workforce for the first time at scale. The plan was real. The financing logic was where Vision 2030 got complicated. Every rial invested in Vision 2030 had to come from somewhere. Saudi Arabia has no income tax. The Saudi government depends on oil for the vast majority of fiscal revenues. The Public Investment Fund was designated as the primary engine of Vision 2030. The PIF needed capital. The solution was to partially float Saudi Aramco on the stock market. MBS wanted a $2 trillion valuation for Aramco. That valuation would have raised $100 billion for Vision 2030 in a single transaction. The December 2019 IPO raised $25.6 billion and valued the company at $1.7 trillion. That result was significant, but well below MBS's stated target. Within months, Aramco shares fell below the IPO price as oil markets turned volatile. The grand financial lever MBS needed delivered less than half of what he expected. The PIF still needed funding. The answer was the same answer it always was: oil revenue. Economists studying resource-dependent economies call this the oil trap. The trap exists not because oil runs out, but because diversification costs require the very revenues diversification is supposed to replace. Every new mega project, every new ministry, every subsidy reform requires capital. That capital comes from Aramco dividends paid to the Saudi government. Aramco pays those dividends from oil sales. Saudi Arabia must therefore produce more oil to fund the programs designed to reduce oil dependency. In 2024, oil still accounted for 60% of total Saudi government revenue. The non-oil sector grew to 55.6% of real GDP in early 2025, up from 45.4% in 2016. That growth represents genuine progress. But the government's fiscal position still depends on oil prices staying above the IMF break-even threshold of approximately $96 per barrel. When oil prices fall below that threshold, deficit spending begins. Deficit spending draws down reserves. Those reserves were built from oil. Every layer of the system connects back to the same single input. NEOM is the most visible expression of this logic pushed to its extreme. In 2017, MBS unveiled NEOM as a $500 billion futuristic city in the Northwest Desert. NEOM was to be built from scratch on empty land roughly the size of Belgium. Inside NEOM sat the flagship project, the Line. The Line was designed as a linear city stretching 170 kilometers through the desert. The Line would house 1.5 million people with zero cars and zero carbon emissions. The Line became the global symbol of Vision 2030's ambition. By March 2025, internal documents reported the total NEOM cost had grown to an estimated $8.8 trillion. That figure exceeds Saudi Arabia's annual budget by more than 25 times. The line itself had been scaled back from 170 kilometers to 2.4 kilometers. Saudi Arabia's finance minister acknowledged publicly that some projects would be delayed or cancelled. NEOM was then quietly reclassified as a PIF-independent ecosystem. That reclassification effectively removed NEOM from the Vision 2030 performance metrics the project was supposed to prove. In August 2023, BRICS formally invited Saudi Arabia to become a full member. BRICS is the bloc of emerging economies led by China, India, Russia, and Brazil. Joining BRICS would have given Saudi Arabia new markets and alternative trade frameworks. Joining would also have reduced Saudi dependence on Western financial systems. For a country trying to diversify away from a single economic model, this looked like exactly the strategic opening Vision 2030 needed. Saudi Arabia declined. As of mid-2025, the kingdom still had not accepted the BRICS membership. Saudi Arabia attends BRICS meetings but holds no formal member status. The reason is precise and structural. BRICS members actively promote trade settlement in currencies other than the US dollar. Replacing dollar-priced oil would weaken the petrodollar system underpinning Saudi Arabia's financial architecture since 1974. Saudi Arabia's ability to recycle oil revenues into US treasuries depends on that system remaining intact. Saudi Arabia's access to Western capital markets also depends on it. Breaking from the petrodollar to join an anti-dollar bloc would destabilize the very financial foundation Vision 2030 requires. Saudi Arabia cannot afford to dismantle the architecture it is trying to escape. That is not a political calculation. That is the oil trap operating at a geopolitical level. Norway faced a version of this same challenge in the 1970s and chose a structurally different path. When Norwegian oil revenues began flowing, the government created a strict fiscal rule. Oil revenue could not be spent directly on the domestic Norwegian economy. Revenues went instead into the government pension fund Global, which invested entirely in foreign assets. The Norwegian government could only spend the expected real return of that fund, approximately 3% annually. Today the government pension fund Global holds nearly $2 trillion in assets. Norway essentially quarantined the oil wealth from the domestic economy. Quarantining the oil forced the non-oil Norwegian sector to develop on its own terms. Saudi Arabia never quarantined its oil revenues. Saudi Arabia spent those revenues on salaries, subsidies, and now mega projects. The UAE took a middle path. Abu Dhabi's Mubadala Fund invested oil revenues externally while Dubai built a non-oil economy through logistics, finance, and tourism. Dubai accepted the discipline of limited direct oil revenues. Saudi Arabia is attempting the Dubai model. Saudi Arabia is doing so with a population 6 times larger, a far deeper state dependency on oil revenues, and a timeline measured in years rather than decades. Vision 2030 raises a question the Saudi government has not officially answered. Is Vision 2030 a genuine economic transformation, or the most expensive public relations campaign in history? The honest answer is, both elements are present, and the distinction matters less than the mechanism. Non-oil GDP is genuinely growing. Women's workforce participation has risen substantially under Vision 2030 reforms. Foreign visitors are arriving in Saudi Arabia in meaningful numbers for the first time. But the fiscal architecture remains oil-dependent. The flagship project, NEOM, has been quietly reclassified and scaled back by 98% of its original length. Saudi Arabia is funding the diversification using the thing Vision 2030 is supposed to replace. Saudi Arabia is not failing at Vision 2030. Saudi Arabia is learning, in real time, at extraordinary expense, that escaping the oil trap requires changing not just what you build, but how you fund what you build. The world is watching because the answer matters far beyond the Arabian desert. Every petro state from Nigeria to Kazakhstan to Venezuela is running a version of this same calculation. Saudi Arabia has the resources, the ambition, and the timeline to show whether that calculation can work. The question is whether 2030 is a deadline or a starting point. If you think Saudi Arabia will pull it off, or if you think the math simply cannot work, tell us below. The comment section is where this analysis gets interesting. Subscribing to WorldStages takes 3 seconds and tells the algorithm that this kind of content matters.